We'll call him Ronald, but that's not his real name. Suffice it to say, Ronald made a big impression on me as part of the first church that I pastored. Pretty much any time I had an initiative to bring to the church, Ronald was against it. Now, his reasons varied for his opposition, but generally speaking, you could mark it down, Ronald was not in favor of whatever I wanted to do. Ever. Ever. Now, don't get me wrong, he had a couple of ministry things with which he was involved, but what was really hard for me was that I felt like I could never do anything that he thought would be okay. We did a senior adult Bible study. Thursday mornings, we met at 10 o'clock, and the attendance for that was very good. About 20 senior adults would show up weekly for that. And no matter how good the study was, Ronald would say, I know that you like to do that at 10, but I think we should do that at 11. If we were studying the Old Testament, he thought we should be studying the New Testament, and vice versa. When we did building renovation that took care of some of the things that we needed to deal with aesthetically in our church, as well as encapsulating the asbestos the way we were told to do it in those days, he thought it would have been better had we done it differently, even though we did it the legal way. When I preached, I held my Bible in my left hand, as I typically do these days, and he would tell me it would be better if I would hold my Bible up so more people could see it. Well, I have a Bible or two. He didn't like my paisley ties in those days and mentioned he thought stripes would look better for our television cameras. I couldn't win. This went on for over a decade. I didn't kill him. I know what you're thinking. Every once in a while I'd get my fill and I would say something to him about it, and it was meant to be a little bit humorous. And I would say, Ronald, I just can't do anything to please you. And then I'd quickly say something like, and thankfully that's not my job anyway. Now the funny thing is we were very cordial in our conversations. I kidded him a lot about his negative disposition. When I resigned from that church, after 13 years of ministry there, they held a nice reception for us. And I went over to Ronald and said something that surprised him. I said, Ronald, some of the things that you put me through here were things I did not appreciate. I didn't like the fact that you never agreed with me on anything I did, ever. Ever. But I want you to know that you've made me a better man and a better pastor. He was stunned. He didn't get it, but I meant it. The reason his opposition made me a better man and a better pastor was because I could never allow myself to become complacent. I always knew I'd better have the answer, and I had to make sure I'd always thought through all of the angles about a particular initiative before I would bring it to the church, because Ronald was going to make sure that he called me on the carpet about it. Without really knowing what a great benefit he brought to my life, the truth is, he really helped me. Now, I'm not saying I liked it, but he helped me. He made me think critically about what I was doing, and his constant disagreement and criticism, I believe, was used by God to keep me from becoming puffed up. I was a young man pastoring the leading church in our community, and we were growing like crazy, and Ronald didn't even like that. But in the midst of all of my wins in ministry, his opposition kept my ego in check. Now, please, don't feel like you have to take his place in my life, okay? But the point is obvious. We all need people, not necessarily opposition, but we all need people to keep us in check. We, even as believers, need lessons in pride and humility, don't we? I like when people like to talk about things, even things about which we might disagree. It's a sign of self-confidence and it's a sign of maturity to be able to talk with someone with whom we differ. That's how we grow. So Ronald helped me grow. The two pastors that followed me in that church helped the church grow from about 400 to 100. And Ronald didn't like that either, so he eventually left. I'm just thankful he didn't move to Kansas City. So this morning, as we continue our study through the Gospel according to Matthew, and we've just been going verse by verse through this, we're going to be talking about pride and humility. And we all have to deal with this, and we have to deal with them. And if you think you've got your pride under control completely, that's probably a sign of pride. James 4:6 reminds us, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Jesus is going to offer some woes to the scribes and Pharisees, and in so doing, He's going to be issuing a warning to His followers. As He describes how they seek the limelight and self-exaltation, He's going to say to His followers, but not you. That is not how you behave. And by inference, not us either. So here we go. Even if the rest of the world is fine with being prideful, not us. Not us. Matthew's Gospel, the 23rd chapter, beginning with verse 1. I'll invite you to stand as we show respect to God for His word to us. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to His disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Thank you so much. You may be seated. Can you imagine the difference it would make in the church universal if we just followed this one concept related to pride and humility? What a difference it would make in the world. What would it be like if across the board, even just within the church, if we would replace pride with humility? And yet the truth is, we say that this concept, the idea that pride should be replaced with humility, we say this is one of the hallmarks of our faith. But we know as believers, do we not? We know there's a problem. And listen, the problem is oftentimes not with them, it's with us. Translated, it's with me. Anytime another believer stumbles or falls, if that does anything except break your heart, you might have a pride issue. If you've ever had the feeling of glee in your heart because something didn't go well for somebody else, that's very likely a pride issue. I'm not going to say I'm always right about that, because then that would be prideful on my part. In churches, sometimes people say, did you hear about such and such church? I heard this or that happened and things are in such disarray there. Again, if there's ever any joy in passing along heartache because of what another church is dealing with, there's an issue of pride and, dare I say it, probably even a bit of sickness. In any case, it's wrong. When other churches win, we win. Right? When other Christians win, we win. When other churches are hurting, we ought to be hurting. As Dr. Steve Brown says, when you cry, I ought to taste salt. So we know that within the body of Christ, the church in its universal expression as well as its local expression, from time to time we know we don't get it right. How do we explain that? Well, we explain it by explaining how it was with the scribes and Pharisees back in the day. So let's dig in. First of all, I want you to recognize this morning there is sometimes a disconnect between preaching and practice. There is sometimes a disconnect between preaching and practice. Look with me again at chapter 23, verse 1 and following, and I'll hold my Bible in my left hand. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to His disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. There's sometimes a disconnect between preaching and practice. You've heard the old adage, do as I say, not as I do. Translated, most of the time that means we want someone to do something we're not willing to do ourselves, or we want them not to do something that we're actually doing. At some level, that is pretty hypocritical. Now, I'm so glad that as a kid, my parents never used that logic. They were not above doing what they wanted me to do or not doing what they didn't want me to do. Does that make sense? As a side note, in a very healthy way, that's how you maintain a certain sense of moral authority, especially with your kids. Right? Jesus is here describing the scribes and Pharisees. He's exposing a bit of their hypocrisy. He's pointing out that these people would talk and teach, but without actually helping others do what they were asking them to do. They knew the right words and could speak well, but they just lacked in the terms of what they were actually supposed to be doing. Chapter 23 and verse 4 alludes to the burdens that they laid on people's shoulders. This is about the things that they are, in fact, teaching, and they're not willing to help people at all fulfill the teaching that they're actually sharing. So these burdens came to the people via the teachings of the Pharisees. Granted, sometimes they taught the right stuff. That is, sometimes they sat in Moses' seat, teaching the right things that Moses, in fact, taught. This is, I think, what Jesus means in verse 3 when he says, "So do whatever they tell you." When they would properly teach the Word, they functioned as proper successors of Moses. Sometimes they did it right, but we know sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they taught God's law, but then failed to live out God's law. They preach, but do not practice, as Jesus says in verse 3. Now, lest you think I'm tying up a heavy burden and laying it on your shoulders, let me be quick to say, listen carefully, nobody is perfect. Nobody gets it right all the time, right? Bunch of prideful people, you think you get it right all the time? We're called to believe certain things, and we're called to live out certain things, and in turn, we are, in fact, called to hold up a standard, the standard of righteousness. But all the while, we know, even while we're holding up that standard as believers, we know that we will not completely measure up. If we did, we wouldn't have needed the gospel of Jesus in the first place. Lori and I stood before a pastor and a congregation almost 30 years ago, and I promised to love, honor, and cherish her. And I've done that, but not perfectly. I've sought to measure up to the covenant that we made together, but I haven't always done it perfectly. 13 years ago, I entered into a covenant relationship with this church, and I go back and read that covenant periodically. I've sought to live up to my part of it, but I haven't always done it perfectly. And guess what? Neither have you. Right? You know why? Because we're still in the process of sanctification. We're not home yet. I get it. I know that in my life, sometimes even when I try, I don't get it right. I love the story that's told about King James I, and I tell you, I can so identify with the preacher of the story. As the story goes, King James I became annoyed with the irrelevant ramblings of his court preacher, and he shouted up to the pulpit, "Either make sense or come down out of that pulpit." And the preacher replied, "I will do neither." Certainly, we've got to make sense with what we say, but as children of God and ambassadors for Christ, we also have to back up what we say with how we live. Richard Baxter once wrote, "Don't unsay with your life what you say with your tongue." So there is sometimes a disconnect between preaching and practice. Secondly, not only there's sometimes a disconnect between preaching and practice, but there is often a connection between pride and presentation. Look with me at verse 5 and following. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. There's often a connection between pride and presentation. I know what you're thinking. What in the world do phylacteries, fringes, synagogues, and rabbis have to do with us? I'm glad you asked. Phylacteries, if you remember from your Sunday school days, phylacteries were little leather boxes that the scribes and Pharisees strapped around their wrist or around their forehead. They were filled with text, biblical text from the Torah. These Pharisees took literally the words from Exodus 13, verse 9, "And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth." So they did this. They had these phylacteries. They did this to be seen as really, really pious. Look again at what Jesus says in 23:5. Broad phylacteries and long fringes. It wasn't that Jesus took issue with them taking their scripture seriously. Jesus' challenge seems to be, as someone noted, broad boxes for big heads. It's kind of like a friend of mine. When we go out to dinner or lunch, whatever, when we go out to eat, he's a pastor, lives in another state. He'll never hear this, so I'm good. When it comes time to pray, we try to figure out who's going to pray, and he'll pray, and that's great. But anyway, when we're out to dinner, we're talking like you and I would be talking right now, talking about baseball or church or whatever. And then when it comes time to pray, he goes like this: "Dear God." And I kind of look at him like, is he possessed? I mean, it kind of scares me. But then he prays for world peace and Lottie Moon and Annie Armstrong and the missionaries around the world, and our food gets cold, and he does it loudly enough that my mother in heaven can hear him. And I'm just telling you, it comes across, and I'm not judging him, but it comes across as a bit pious, like make sure everybody hears kind of what we're doing. The fringes that Jesus mentioned were those blue or white strings that you sometimes see on a Jewish prayer shawl to this day. In the time of Jesus, they were sewn onto the four corners of the hem of the outer robe. This was connected to Numbers chapter 15, verses 37 through 41. Again, the issue was not the adornment itself, but rather the adornment taken to the extreme. Apparently, as they did this, they came across as very ostentatious. Notice Jesus' words about these very things: long, broad, and here it is, sports fans, to be seen. Long, broad, to be seen. It's one thing to put your proverbial best foot forward. In fact, I think we should do that. And in reality, I wish that we Christians would really take that seriously. But it's a different thing altogether when our pride is such that it causes us to be presumptuous in how we present ourselves. And unfortunately, there is often a connection between pride and presentation. Sean O'Donnell offers some good insights here. We have to be careful about this issue and how we evaluate it. For example, if you're wondering what this would even look like, at the risk of sounding harsh, think of a bishop from the church at Rome with a large red hat on his head, a big silver shepherd's staff in his hand, a golden cross on his chest, and 59 rather large rosary beads around his waist. That might get you on the way toward understanding what Jesus is talking about here. But the truth of the matter is, as a non-Catholic, that's a very easy one to pick on. As non-Catholics, we might also consider the hipster pastor who calls attention to himself by wearing skinny jeans and canvas shoes that look like they cost $2, but everybody knows they cost $200. And a winter scarf below his hairsprayed bedhead when it's 100 degrees outside. O'Donnell says, how many levels lower on the ostentatious scale is the rock star showmanship of the hipster worship pastor, and then the coronation of Pope Leo XIII, entering the Sistine Chapel of the Vatican Palace on his pontifical chair under a white canopy borne by 8 clerics to be crowned with the traditional 3-tiered Papal Tiara. As a Cardinal says, receive the tiara adorned with 3 crowns and know that thou art the Father of princes and kings, the ruler of the world, the vicar of the earth, the vicar on the earth of our Savior Jesus Christ. As O'Donnell concludes, he says, the rock star worship leader and the kingly pope are both outrageous pictures. You see, the pompous leaders loved the best seats and the best greetings. They thought they were deserving of the best food and the best hospitality and a seat next to the host. And Jesus takes exception to this. Listen, nobody gets the throne but Christ. What Jesus is talking about here is what these men are doing, how they're drawing attention to themselves, and how they do all, notice that, all, not some, but they do all their deeds to be seen by others. This past week, nothing sums this up better than the prosperity gospel evangelist Jesse Duplantis. Did you guys see that? He was reminding his followers that he needed a $54 million jet. Now, not to be confused with Creflo Dollar of the same ilk, who wanted a $55 million jet. Jesse's going to settle for a $54 million jet. Now, let me just say, if you're tempted to send money, let me know, because as you know, being married to Lori, I've got a lot of bracelets to pay for. So there's sometimes a disconnect between preaching and practice. There's often a connection between pride and presentation. Thirdly, there is always a need for keeping it real. Verses 8 through 11. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. There's always a need for keeping it real. We could spend a lot of time on this, but I have a birthday party to go to this afternoon, so we're going to blaze on. Suffice it to say, the issue that Jesus is raising is the problem of religious leaders being enamored with being called titles of honor that might engender a sense of superiority within them. I have a friend from high school named John, and he has a Facebook page and a website with his name, and then the phrase, keeping it real. I like that. Keeping it real. John's idea was there's already enough pretense in the world. Why don't we create an environment where people can just be themselves, just be real, and let's get rid of all of the presumption. Let's just be real. But here's the thing. Pretense and presumption comes in a lot of different forms. For example, the title pastor can be a beautiful expression of a relationship between a shepherd and the people he serves. And I love the title, pastor, but not in that unhealthy way. Let me be clear, and I mean that sincerely. And in fact, if you know much about the vocation of a shepherd from the New Testament era, you know the title did not and does not, in today's culture, carry a lot of clout. In fact, today to be a pastor is to start sort of below ground level relationally with people because they don't look at us the way they did 40 years ago. So pastor can be a humble title, but what about the title His Eminence or His Holiness? I kind of like that one. His Eminence. You get the picture? Don't call any Bible teacher most reverend, because he's not. He's not. Nobody really is. We just have to be careful. The titles aren't really the problem. We're the problem. It's what we do with them. Now, the truth of the matter is, I love to give respect that certain people and vocations deserve. I love that. I love, in fact, the formality behind some of that. Those of you that have heard me speak more than once, if I ever allude to the president, regardless of who is in office, Republican, Democrat, etc., I'll refer to them as President so-and-so or Mr. so-and-so. I think we need to be respectful about those offices. I love the formality behind some of that. But we have to make sure that we are, as my friend John says, that we are keeping it real. Think about the early church. Can you imagine? Just get this picture. Can you imagine the Apostle Peter letting people call him Your Eminence? What about Paul, the apostle? Can you imagine how he would feel if people referred to him as Your Holiness? They were fishermen, tent makers. So the answer to that is a big fat no. They would have liked that. When I was first called to be your pastor, one of our ladies who is now in heaven, I think anyway, made a beeline to me and she said, "So you're a reverend and you're a pastor, and to really complicate things, you're a doctor." Now, I'm not sure, but I think she was a little put off with all of that, to be honest. So my response took her a bit by surprise. She said, "So, reverend, pastor, doctor, what are we supposed to call you anyway?" And I said, "How about Ken? That's what my parents named me after all." But as she walked away, I thought, "Your Eminence will do." See what happens when I go off script? You ever wonder why God hasn't struck me dead standing right here? Well, you're going too, so don't get puffed up. All right, let's finish this up. The sooner the better, right? Yeah. There's sometimes a disconnect between preaching and practice. We saw that. There is often a connection between pride and presentation. We've been warned about that. And there is always a need for keeping it real. Fourthly, finally, and quickly, time and truth go hand in hand. That's beautiful. Time and truth go hand in hand. Verse 12, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." Say that with me. "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." I'm not going to elaborate on it because you read the paper or you've been to the news sites on the web, even in our own denomination. And I have addressed this at length on a Wednesday night, by the way. We have seen this reality play out. I want you to know that time and truth always go hand in hand. They always have, and they always will. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. It may take a while for the truth to be known, but rest assured, my brothers and sisters, time and truth go hand in hand. This is a little humorous, but it makes my point. Some of you will remember the name Chris Kearney. Some of you, in fact, know Dr. Kearney. He's one of my best friends, or was, till I shared this story. And you may recall that a few years ago, Dr. Kearney came and spoke to our church in an interview setting about Christians and mental health issues. I have a great concern about that. There are a lot of people in the body of Christ that don't understand that our brothers and sisters and people in the world deal with things in terms of a mental health challenge that have nothing to do with their spirituality. And so they're made to feel guilty for being depressed or being anxious or whatever, and that ought not to be the case. So I invited Dr. Kearney in to talk about this. Now this is, by the way, this is an illustration of being exalted and being humbled, so keep that in mind and stay with me. Dr. Kearney and I play golf together quite a bit, and frankly, we needle each other quite a bit. So we played golf together just last week, early one morning. I had a pretty good front nine, and the back nine was, let's say, less than stellar. When we finished, we were tied according to the scorecard that Kearney kept. But we really weren't tied. So Kearney thought he'd needle me just a bit on Facebook. Now, those of you that are golfers, you know you never talk about another man's golf score, much less in public, much less on social media, right? So he knew better, but he posted a picture and he wrote, there's a beautiful picture, beautiful shot of Swope Memorial Golf Course with downtown KC in the distance, tied my golf buddy with an 87 after draining a par putt on number 18. Ken Parker has a great foot wedge. That means I cheat, but I don't cheat is the point. I had not moved the ball. You guys that are golfers understand, I did not move the ball with my foot all day. In fact, I don't take mulligans either. I don't. And I guarantee that if I chose to cheat, I would have scored a whole lot better than an 87. So then my friend, to needle me, and he's just joking, I don't cheat, he's needling me. He puts it on Facebook, and then another pastor friend chimes in and says, well, we call that pastoral privilege. So then Cornine posts something else, needling me, all in good fun, about using a foot wedge, and I said something about his putting and windmills. So I told him, and don't look at Facebook now, I know who you are, stay with me. So I told him, I said, you've given me a great illustration for my sermon about pride and humility. You see, now I'm forced to tell the whole world the truth about Dr. Cornine's score. So I put it on Facebook, and I'm telling you. You see, on number 16, he pulled his tee shot into the weeds. So he's hitting his third shot, according to the rules of golf, his third shot from the tee. It's a par 3, third shot. So I wrote on Facebook, how about your par? Notice the quotation marks. I told him, I'm thinking we should coin a phrase, call it a cornine. That would be a pulled out-of-bounds tee shot, then hitting your third shot from the tee box, but counting it as 1, hitting the green, 2-putting, taking a 5, but writing down a 3. That's a cornine. And suddenly, my friend Chris Cornine went silent. And I sent him a message that said, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. That was true for the scribes and Pharisees, and listen carefully, that's true for us too.